All right, guys, so we're out here somewhere in California, I'm not quite sure where, and we are testing out a couple of things today. We've got new firmware updates for the Canon R5, for the RED Komodo, it's the 600D. Cam's got the Forza 500 from Nanlite, and we are just gonna run some tests to see how they balance out in the late afternoon sun. I'm not expecting them to overpower the sun, but I would be pleasantly surprised if they did. We do know that the Forza 500 can at least add some fill light to balance out a scene. So we're gonna put it in a large modifier. We're gonna put both lights in a large modifier and see if we can actually make them directional key lights outdoors to have complete control over our lighting. So we just ran some tests between the Nanlite Forza 500 and the Aputure 600D. We ran them on the RED Komodo with the Vazen 28mm and the lights. We switched them around so that they were exactly the same distance. We kept the mark the same. And the results, honestly, they're almost identical. It's kind of hard to tell the difference. We did two tests. We did one where the sun was still over the horizon, so there was still more sun to fight against. And then we did another test, which was easier for both lights when the sun was already over the hill, so it was a little bit easier to control the ambient light. And I think in both cases, the power output from both lights was negligibly close. Like, there wasn't much of a difference. The only real difference between these two lights is the price. The Aputure light is a little bit beefier, it's a little bit heavier, it is harder to rig. You definitely want a robust C-stand for it. So one thing that the Aputure definitely has over the Nanlite is the yoke. With the Aputure light, you have two hands to freely move it. It's a very simple mechanism, and look, it even goes all the way. You can go 360 degrees, which is really great if you're gonna rig this to like a beam board or something overhead. The Nanlite, on the other hand, and this is just one thing that drives me nuts, is that it requires two hands because the yoke is on both sides. So if you want to move the light, you have to loosen both of these yokes, move the light, and the thing is, there isn't a lot of room on the threads, so you can very easily accidentally loosen them too much, and then this whole thing, I'm not going to do it because it's a pain in the ass to put back on, but this whole thing comes off, and then you kind of have to like slide everything back and tighten it up. So it's just really annoying, and I know it doesn't seem like such a big deal, but it's one of those things that when you're on set and you just want to be quick and efficient, it can quickly like frustrate the hell out of you. So this one minor design flaw is one major reason why this light's such a pain in the butt to use. Otherwise, it's still a fantastic value. That is my take on the two lights. They are both really great lights. They give fantastic output, but if we're just looking at bang for your buck, I gotta say the Nanlite probably wins. So I have a couple more thoughts about these lights that I couldn't quite gather when I was on location with Cam. And I think if I really have to think about it, if I were to keep one light, it would be the Aputure light, and I will explain why. First things first, why would you need lights that are this powerful? These are pretty powerful lights, and it seems obvious if you're trying to overpower the sun, if you need to control your ambient light, these lights are gonna go a lot further. But in most cases, you know, you're just shooting interviews and indoors in a studio. You don't need lights that are this strong, like a 300D or even a 120D might be powerful enough if you're gonna open up your f-stop a little bit, especially because these cameras are shooting at like 800 ISO anyway if you're shooting log. So you get plenty of output in normal situations from much cheaper lights. But when you move your camera back, when you shoot wider shots, you have to move your lights back, obviously, because then they're gonna be in the shot, and then you lose a lot of output. And if you're putting your lights in these, you know, soft boxes, these 42-inch or even 60-inch soft boxes, when you move them further back, they lose a lot of that softness because the relative size of the light source shrinks as well. So you have to put your lights through some large diffusion, some large scrims or bounces. That's why you see like these 10 by 10 or 12 by 12 frames. and you start getting much larger light sources. And if you're moving your light back, then you need a much stronger light to get the same output at the same exposure, at the same f-stop, etc. And very quickly, you're going to see that lights like the 300D even are just not up to the task. And then obviously when you switch locations and you go outdoors and you're trying to compete with the sun, every little lux of light is going to come in handy for those situations for much of the same reasons, except now you're competing with, you know, the brightest thing in the universe, kind of, in our universe at least. So that's why these lights are important. And between the two of them, the output is not that dramatic. I mean, it's going to fluctuate based on what kind of modifiers you have on them. Both of these lights have their own respective Fresnel mounts. I don't have the Aputure one yet because it's not available, but that obviously greatly increases the output of the beam. But then when you put them in these large softboxes like I have here, the output shrinks. So for me personally, the Aputure light is way more flexible for that, because I tend to do a lot of interviews where very often we're just putting the light in a softbox. So you're not going to get the same kind of output as you would if you put the reflector head on it. When it comes to a head-to-head comparison in such a scenario, the Aputure light is just going to give you a little bit more power. But that's really not the main reason why I would pick the Aputure light over the Forza if I had to pick one. I own both of them because the Forza was available first and I really needed a light with a higher output at the time. This was before COVID, when I was working a lot more frequently. Ever since COVID, I've been working less, but the Aputure light just had some features on it that made it the more appealing option, not the least of which was the higher output. But then there's also the better build quality. The Forza, I'm sorry, but it just feels cheap, and I'm not confident that that light's gonna last very long. I mean, look, so far I've had it for like a year and it hasn't given me any issues, but I am pretty anal when I take care of my gear, and because of COVID, I really haven't been working as much as I normally would. But it would be interesting to see how rough and how much abuse that light can take during normal working conditions, when I'm working more frequently and other people are handling the light and somebody drops it, somebody kicks it. I mean, it happens, right? And with the Aputure light, it feels like really high quality metal. I don't know what it's called. I think it's like some sort of like aircraft grade aluminum that they make it out of, but it can definitely take abuse. It definitely feels solid. The cables are really robust. They're really strong. The connections, there just aren't any weak links when it comes to the build quality of the Aputure light. But when it comes to the Forza, there's just so many places that I can already see like, this is gonna break, this is gonna break, this is cheap plastic, this is cheap. So you're compromising on build quality, and if you're the type of person who maybe the light's not gonna go anywhere, maybe it's just gonna stay in your studio, then maybe that doesn't matter as much. But for me personally, build quality matters, just because I tend to shoot in a lot of situations where things get dropped. I mean, just the last two shoots that I was on with Cameron, we were out in the desert. There's dust, there's winds picking up, and when you're just, stuff happens on set. People drop things, people kick things, things topple over sometimes, which they shouldn't be, but it happens, and I just like the assurance, the reassurance that the product is gonna last. Like, if you buy cheap, you buy twice, so I just have more confidence in the longevity of the Aputure lights. The price difference is $500, which seems like a lot, but then when you factor in the better build quality and the remote options that the Aputure comes with, or for example, this little remote, which you can program multiple lights to. See, very quick, very easy to adjust. I think the Forza, you have to buy that separately, so factor into the cost of the light if you want those options. The Aputure also has the Sidus Link app with your phone, where you can program an assortment of Aputure lights. If you already have the entire ecosystem with you, it's just very flexible. If you own a bunch of Aputure lights already, when you're on a set, again, to just make things quicker, especially because on a lot of sets, at least that I work on, I'm not working with big crews or anything. When you factor that in, the price difference also starts to shrink. And then when you factor in that stupid pain in the ass yoke that the Forza light has, you know what I'm talking about because I already showed it in the video, but that double yoke thing where you have to screw both sides to adjust it, it gets very annoying very fast. And if you go too far with loosening it, you actually take the entire head off, and then you have to put it back and you have to squeeze it together, and it's just such a pain in the ass, and it's just not something I want to deal with when I have a million other things to think about. I am against anything that makes you look like an idiot in front of your client, and that is one thing that'll definitely make you look really stupid really fast. So For that reason, I prefer the Aputure light again, and I can't overestimate how important that design flaw is in my decision. That being said, the Forza does have some advantages. The Forza is lighter, it's easier to rig. The Aputure light is much beefier, much heavier. You're going to need heavier stands, more manpower, larger crew if you're going to rig it up in complex situations. But personally, if I was doing something like that, I would just hire, help for that. I wouldn't try to do that by myself. The one main advantage I would say that the Forza has is in battery life, because it can run at full power on 26-volt batteries for about an hour, which is huge. If I was running these lights outdoors without a power source, I would prefer to have a generator, but that's not always an option because generators are loud, and if you have to record sound, that might complicate things. And again, if you're on a smaller crew, generators are heavy and they're just, one more thing to encumber your production that you might not want to deal with. So if you have to run battery power, if you have to, travel lighter, the Forzas are going to be able to do that. The Aputure lights only run at 50% with the same 26-volt batteries. I think they are capable of running for much longer at much higher outputs with certain amp batteries, but I think Aputure said they don't even make those batteries yet, so that's not really an option at the moment. So for right now, the Forza still has its place for much lighter run and gun kind of setups. But if I had to pick only one light, I would definitely go with the Aputure light, because when you get onto a larger set, the advantages quickly start to put themselves on display. And also, Aputure have like a much more reliable name. They've done an excellent job establishing themselves in the industry. They've come a long way. Their name actually means something now. It kind of represents quality. Forza is still kind of viewed as this cheap Chinese knockoff brand. Like I mentioned a similar argument when I was deciding between my Z-Cam, selling it, and it's just the same kind of skepticism that people look at these products with, even if it may or may not be as well deserved. Although I do think that the build quality on the Forza might cause some people to question it. It certainly does for me. But they are both fantastic lights, and there are other options. Godox makes some lights. I haven't tested them, so I can't really speak for them, but you have an embarrassment of riches when it comes to lighting products these days, and I think that you really can't go wrong. But if you're willing to spend the extra $500, which I know seems like a lot, but when you factor in everything that the Aputure does, in addition to what the Forza does, I think the price difference is just not that dramatic in the grand scheme of things, especially if you're doing this for a living, especially if you're bringing this onto a professional set. I don't think it's something that I'm going to split hairs over. I definitely highly recommend the Aputure light over the Forza 500. But look, if you can only afford the Forza or the Godox, obviously your budget, do what you got to do. But if you have the money and you're just kind of on the fence about being cheap about it, just spend the extra $500, get the Aputure lights, because here's the thing. Once you start collecting more Aputure lights, then you're just going to be able to program them all into your phone or your iPad, and then it's just a very seamless, very smooth experience. And I think ultimately it just comes down to user experience. I think that's a very important quality that brands offer that I think is overlooked. I think that's why Apple is so successful and why I own so many Apple products, because there's just a lot to be said about user experience. If you have all the specs and all the fancy technology into something, but it's just not presented in a usable, easy to work with kind of package, it can quickly become a turnoff. So I think Aputure has a great user experience. They have some issues to sort out. Their ability to actually get these lights out to people and their accessories is still very frustrating because they're still very hard to get. I really want to get that Fresnel that they offer for this light, but again, it's out of stock everywhere, so I wish they would improve their ability to produce things. But otherwise, those are my thoughts. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments, and I will see you next time.